good reason. So let me start with the collect for the Epiphany. We're going to talk about that first, and then we're going to go into some of the history. So let us pray. O God, by the leading of a star, you manifested your only Son to the peoples of the earth. Lead us, who know you now by faith, to your presence, where we may see your glory face to face, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
This is one you don't necessarily get to hear unless we do a service on the feast day itself. And it is when we look at the church as it's structured now, and we look at the principal feast days of the year, we have 7 principal feasts, and Epiphany being one of them. But unless Epiphany falls on a Sunday, or the parish you're in happens to be called the Church of the Epiphany, you may not do a service necessarily on that day. Now, I will say, growing up in the church, Dad always did a service on the Feast of the Epiphany, no matter when it fell. But I think that was more common in those days than it is now. Now, certainly at monasteries and places who have an established Eucharist every day of the week, of course it's going to be done. But I think in your mainstream parishes, if it's on a Tuesday night, you're probably not going to have a service necessarily. So we don't get to hear it that much. So let me read a little bit about that collect. And Jeff and Valerie and Robin, I didn't go back to last night. This actually is Wednesday night. So we tend to talk about the Epiphany or the collect at lectionary. So this is new. Well, it's not new. It's somewhat new to this prayer book, to the 79 prayer book. So let me read what it says here. The 1549 version of this collect, 1549 being the first book of Common Prayer. The 1549 version of this collect retained the present revision, substantially weakened the contrast between faith and sight of the original Gregorian text. So that means it comes out of the Gregorian sacramentary. The translation of the petition, based on that prepared by Captain Howard E. Galley, restored the original integrity. So Captain Galley took the Latin collect in the Gregorian sacramentary and did a new translation, which is what we have now in the 79 prayer book. As the wise men were led by a star, so we are led by faith to his presence. The petition of the previous books read, mercifully grant that we, who know thee now by faith, may after this life have the fruition of thy glorious Godhead. And the Latin word in the original collect, the Latin word gentibus, is clarified in the new translation by the reading, the peoples of the earth. So hear that again. O God, by the leading of a star, you manifested your Son to the peoples of the earth. Lead us, who know you now by faith, to your presence, where we may see your glory face to face. And that is opposed to, may after this life have the fruition of thy glorious Godhead. So the previous collect would have had us waiting until we're joined back in heaven to understand that light. But this new translation says, no, we want to see your glory face to face through Jesus Christ our Lord now. It's done, right? So that would suggest then that the feast day and what we celebrate on the feast day speaks to us today. Does that make sense to everyone? And then there's a rubric here that follows the collect in the prayer book, which I'm gonna get to, but not just yet, because it talks about something we're going to bring up in just a little bit, and I think you'll understand it better once we get to some of that information. By the leading of a star, you manifested your only Son to the peoples of the earth. Lead us, who now know you by faith, to your presence, where we may see your glory face to face. Now, let me start with this. So, what are we actually celebrating on the feast day itself today? I mean, in this age.
On the feast day of Epiphany?
Yes.
Actually, is it the baptism of Jesus?
Not as we do it today.
Okay.
The feast day itself focuses on the Magi, on the coming of the wise men to see the I don't know if you want to say the toddler Jesus, the infant, the not a newborn, but probably about 2 years old Jesus in the house where he lived. So
White.
we're told in Matthew's gospel, which is the only gospel that talks about this event, that the Magi come to the house. It says after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the wise men come to the house where he was staying in Bethlehem. And so scholars surmise that Jesus was probably somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4 when this happened. Thus, Herod wanting to kill any male child that was 2 years old or younger. So 2 is probably a more accurate thought about how old Jesus was. But it doesn't say that the wise men came to the manger or came to the stable or anything having to do with other people being there. It clearly identifies Jesus being in the house. So we think it was a later event when that actually happened. And then remember, as we're told in Matthew's gospel, once the wise men leave, Joseph then is told in a dream to take the child and go to Egypt. And we have then Herod killing all the male children of that area.
We think Jim had observed that the baby in our creche looks to be about 2.
At Trinity or at Grace and Trinity, yeah. It sure does. Yeah, I think there's some facial hair growing on him. We comment because if you look at the baby Jesus in our creche at the cathedral, he is large by proportion to Mary and Joseph. And almost the same, but still the baby, almost the same size as Mary, which is kind of fun. Because we think all those pieces were collected at different times for that creche, so they don't match. So what we do in the church now, in the Episcopal Church now, is we focus on the feast day of Epiphany, on the coming of the Magi. But that's not how the feast day of Epiphany started. And Jeff, what you said is where it really began.
Okay, all right. I was confused.
So in fact, the celebration of Epiphany is older in the church than the celebration of the birth of Jesus. It's older than Christmas because actually at the time when Epiphany was celebrated, you were actually celebrating Jesus's birth and Jesus's baptism at the same time, which seems a little odd because you're commemorating a date in which a baby is born and another date in which he is roughly 30 years old.
Yeah.
But the church has a way of sort of mushing things together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we can't celebrate, Jesus's first, his birth, then his presentation, then his first baby tooth, then his first loss of a baby tooth, then the first time he walked. I mean, so there gets to be a point where they're like, well, we can't do every single momentous thing, and we don't even know about those things because those weren't written about. But what we do know, we can celebrate. And so Epiphany really rose up in the Eastern Church before it did in the Western Church. And the Greeks put that emphasis on the baptism of Jesus. And the reason for that is because that is the moment when Jesus' divinity was clearly spoken. And the voice that came from heaven, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And so that then became the manifestation of Christ to the world. Then in later years, you get tacked on the two other events that get put with it, which is the wise men coming, which represents the manifestation of Jesus to the Gentile world. And then you get the first wedding, or the first miracle at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, which represents that Jesus, through that miracle, being made public, right? Although what's interesting about that story is it's not really public, is it?
No.
I mean, it is in the fact that people drank the wine, but they didn't know where it came from. They just assumed, oh, hey, they got more wine. The only people who really know what happened there were the stewards who filled the jars, Mary, and the disciples that accompanied Jesus there. And what we've always been taught, or what I've been taught in the classes I've been in have said, is it's really done for the sake of the disciples who are there. And we think there were probably 5 disciples at this point who were with Jesus at the wedding, because he hadn't called any more than those 5 yet. So this coming Sunday, you're going to hear the calling of the first 4. It's going to talk about the first 4, and we're pretty sure there was a 5th there who just doesn't. We think it's John himself, who just doesn't really talk about himself. Because he tells us there were 2 disciples of John the Baptist who followed Jesus, one of them being Andrew. But we don't know who that other one is. We think it's probably John, but we're not told that. So there's 2. Andrew brings Peter, there's 3, and then you go out and you get Philip and Nathaniel, so it's 5. So we know those 5 are probably with Jesus at the wedding. So it's really that manifestation of Jesus has been named the Divine One, God's Son. Now we have this first miracle, and it's for the disciples to know so that they believe, so that they in turn can then go out and help others to believe, right? And in John's gospel, that's a big point of the miracles, is so that people see and then begin to believe. But then Jesus will turn around at some point and say, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. So in some ways, all we have to go on are these stories, right? That's a big thing in the church. We have the stories, so how do we commemorate these stories? So Epiphany became a festival to celebrate first and foremost the baptism of Jesus. And then we began to put these other 2 events in with it. So the Eastern Church began celebrating Epiphany in the 3rd century, probably later in the 3rd century. The Western Church didn't start that celebration of Epiphany until the 4th century. So not 100 years later, but within 100 years later. Christmas, the festival of Christmas, the earliest date in the Roman practice is in 336 in the 4th century. So Epiphany probably would have started earlier in the 300s, and then you have Rome setting the date of Christmas on December 25th, which coincided with the winter solstice, the high pagan festival, and thus that became the celebration of Christmas. And then there are some writings that the church looked at that said the Feast of the Epiphany would be dated on such and such a day, which if you follow the calendar is January the 6th. That's in the Gregorian calendar. If you follow the Julian calendar, it would be January the 10th. And nobody does it on the 10th. So the 6th then became adopted, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But in the Orthodox tradition, and this still happens in some places today, the Feast of the Epiphany is not actually celebrated until January 7th, which that means, or excuse me, Christmas is not celebrated till January 7th. The Nativity is not celebrated January 7th, which means if Christmas is 12 days, that would make the Feast of the Epiphany on January the 19th. So there are some in the Eastern Church who celebrate Christmas on January the 7th, Epiphany on January the 19th. Because that coincides with the same dates the old writings had said, but in the different calendar, right? Because the Orthodox will still follow the Julian calendar. Does any of that make sense to anybody? That's a lot to say. Well, this is what that's what it is. This is what the church decided.
Yeah.
And so this is what. So I want to read to you something here. This is from a book called Celebrating Liturgical Time, Days, Weeks, and Seasons. This is by Neil Alexander, Bishop Alexander, who, if you remember, preached at my installation. He's now retired, but he was the dean of Swanee, of the seminary at Swanee. So he says this: the Feast of the Epiphany is older than the Feast of Christmas and possesses a much richer tapestry of themes. The first mention we have of Epiphany appears around the turn of the 3rd century from North Africa. The birth of Jesus does not go without mention, but there appears to be no reference to any sort of focus on his nativity as a major theme of the feast. Instead, the baptism of Jesus, the first major narrative in Mark's gospel, is clearly the principal focus. And remember, in Mark's gospel, there is no nativity. There is no mention of the nativity. Slightly later, Jesus' first miracle at a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, the first major narrative of John's gospel after the prologue and introductory materials, begins to figure prominently in the lectionary on the Sunday following the baptism of Jesus. And Neil says, without wading too deeply into the details, it is important to note here that from very early on, the Epiphany feast wove together 3 strands of the biblical tradition about Jesus: the baptism of Jesus with the miraculous dove and voice from heaven, the miracle at a wedding feast in Cana, and the miraculous star that led the Magi to Bethlehem. 3 miracles that pick up the story of his manifestation among us with little or no evident concern about the details of his nativity. That comes later. And then he says, there is perhaps nothing to be gained by trying to overcome the fact that Epiphany brings ritual closure to Christmas in the present shape of our calendar, at least in the experience of most parishes. At the same time, it is important for liturgical ministers and preachers to be mindful that Epiphany is something of a fulcrum that shifts the balance from the incarnation of God seen in relationship to the nativity of Jesus, to the incarnate one being manifest in new ways as God's anointed one, whom we will come to know as teacher, healer, and miracle worker, and ultimately as the crucified and risen one. In other words, while the present shape of things may often make Epiphany seem only the end of Christmas, it is important to recognize, as did the ancient church, that Epiphany is also about looking forward, about beginnings, about what is still to come. I like how he puts that. It is a fulcrum, and I think we see it that way, don't we? Not the feast day itself, but certainly the season as taking us that bridge between, celebrating Jesus's birth and Jesus being thrust into the wilderness and beginning Lent. Any thoughts or comments from anyone at this time?
Well, I think
Oh, go ahead. I just had a question. I'm sitting here with kids' symbols, the star and the dove. But it made me start thinking the star. Are we really supposed to believe that the wise men traveled 2 years? They couldn't have been following the same star, right?
I mean, that's hard to know.
Yeah.
I suppose if it's, I've heard it said that, remember what happened this year on December 21st, where you had the coming together of Jupiter and Saturn and
Yeah.
whatever it was.
Yeah.
That is quite possibly what occurred then. That there was an alignment that the wise men saw, which was bigger and brighter than anything else they had seen, and they began to follow it. Now, you know, I looked up one time, I used it in a sermon, how we're all so quick to pull up Google Maps on our phones when we want to drive somewhere, right? And it'll tell us the fastest route and how much time it's going to take to get there. And so I put in my phone that I wanted to go from Baghdad in Iraq to Bethlehem in Israel. And driving with light traffic, it said it would take 11 hours.
It didn't tell you to follow a star or anything like that.
But it was like 664 miles or something like that.
Oh, wow.
So if you consider somebody seeing something like that and deciding we're going to go see what it is about, and by the time they pack up their stuff and load whatever animals, and we're not even sure it was camels, that's what gets depicted, but I've read all these things that say, you know, camels weren't even native to that region at the time. But by the time they get all that put together and they begin this trip, I don't know how long it takes them. Because you're talking about, they probably travel with several people with them, and they camp at night. So you're going in the daylight hours, you're stopping at night, you have to set up a camp, sleep, eat, take down the camp, and start going again. So I don't know, does that take 2 years to go 664 miles?
In the meantime, the stars don't always.
Well, yeah, the stars will usually leave by then, but
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
who's to say that phenomenon didn't remain for them to see? Or, I mean, that's the element we don't know.
It didn't really appear till the end of the trip.
Right.
So
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. So our hymns are wrong.
well, yes. And it could have been they saw a star, and what Valerie said, well, by the time they got there, that had happened and the star had grown brighter. And that was when that occurrence appeared, and they're like, oh, well, this has got to be it.
Yeah, it just made me wonder. So.
Those are answers that I'm convinced we'll learn one day, but not on this earth.
I was, I find it interesting that the wedding feast at Cana was only mentioned in John, and the actual baptism of Jesus, I think, was only mentioned in the Synoptics and not in John.
Well, technically speaking, only in Matthew and Mark.
Oh, okay. So Luke didn't even mention a baptism.
All Luke says is after Jesus was baptized.
Okay, so does mention a baptism.
Mentions a baptism. John does not mention a baptism at all.
John doesn't, he just recognizes that John was baptizing people, and here comes Jesus walking along, and he says, that's the one right there.
Right, and what he says specifically is John saw the dove descend upon
Right.
Jesus. So we can possibly infer that means he must have been baptized, because that's what the other gospels tell us, but John doesn't specifically mention a baptism.
I just find it interesting that the wedding of Cana, not mentioned in the three, but recognized as one of the most important miracles, the first miracle, and only mentioned in John.
And we have to believe that some of that has to do with the fact that, you know, when John was writing it, that the story of that miracle spoke to him, where maybe it didn't speak to the others as well, you know, or as big. That still doesn't make sense. Didn't have as big as an impact on them as it did on John. That's what you just don't know. And remember too, we talked about this a lot when looking at Matthew. Matthew knows his audience. And so Matthew will change some of the story. He'll change some of the oral traditions to get it to fit what he wants the people to hear about what he believes Jesus is trying to say. Right? And I talked about this a little bit on Sunday, how I think we all have a tendency as Christians to sort of, we've heard all four of the Gospels, we've read all four of the Gospels, and we don't necessarily, when someone says, tell me about the baptism of Jesus, we don't necessarily go, well, it depends who you're reading. If you're talking in Mark's Gospel, it's going to be, you know, we just go, this is what happened, right? So we take collectively those four stories, those four Gospels, and we kind of mush them together, and we get a continuous story out of that. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think ultimately that's what we're supposed to understand, right? And so every one of us can describe an event in the same event in the Gospel. We're going to describe it slightly differently, but the main point's going to be the same, right? And so it's important when you read these things and you study these things that, you know, John had a different audience. John comes, you know, probably about 20 to 25 years after Matthew and Luke, and even more after Mark. So he's already dealing with different things and has a different point to make.
And comes from a different community altogether.
Altogether, right. And, you know, but what's interesting then is you still have things that appear in all four of them, like the feeding of the 5,000. That's mentioned in all four of the Gospels. So I think it's just they're taking the stories that were there and as they were told and saying, well, this one works for me and for what I'm trying to write about Jesus, but this one I don't really need. They've already covered it. I don't need to cover it. And that's not dismissing it. It's just saying that wasn't important to the point they were trying to make at that time, right? Now, the church is notorious for doing that too. To say, well, this was important once upon a time in the church's history, but now it's not as important. So we'll take days that had more significance to them that may not have as much significance now. Or we'll take days that didn't have any significance at all, and now they're suddenly a major celebration. I mean, that the church is notorious for that kind of thing. But we're looking at Epiphany. But here's something that I wanted to point out that's interesting. So when we talk about the season of Christmas, we'll also refer to it as Christmas tide. When you add that tide to it, it relates to the whole season. So Epiphany tide is a section of time starting on a date and ending on a date, right? But there's been debate in the church as to what Epiphany tide really is. So as we know it and receive it in the church today, Christmas is 12 days. It starts on December 25th and it goes through January 5th. Or technically speaking, you could say the evening of the 24th to the evening of the 5th, right? And then we have the feast day of Epiphany, which starts the season of Epiphany, which then today we would say lasts until Lent begins. Whenever that is, right? Because that moves. But there were earlier times in the church where the season was shorter or longer depending on how they looked upon it. So let me read you this thing I found having to do with customs of of celebrating Epiphany. So in many Western Christian churches, the eve of the Feast of the Epiphany is celebrated as 12th night, which would be the night of the 12th day of Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Popular Epiphany customs include Epiphany singing, chalking the door, having one's house blessed, consuming 3 kings cake, not 3 kings cakes, 3 kings cake,
Don't think, not 3 days.
winter swimming, as well as attending church. Well, I'm glad they got church in there. It is customary for Christians in many localities to remove their Christmas decorations on Epiphany Eve, that is on 12th night.
Mhm.
Although those in other Christian countries historically remove them on Candlemas. And who knows when Candlemas is?
Oh.
And no, it's not in like June when your third neighbor down the street finally takes the lights off their house.
Oh.
Candlemas is the same day as the Feast of the Presentation. So that's February 2nd.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
So Christmas tide in this case could last just the 12 days, or it could last 40 days.
Yeah.
And I know some people who leave their Christmas decorations up until Candlemas, which would then be called the conclusion of Epiphany tide
And Groundhog's Day.
and Groundhog's Day.
Yes.
Oh. Okay.
According to the first tradition, who take it down on 12th night, those who fail to remember to remove their Christmas decorations on Epiphany Eve then must leave them untouched until Candlemas. The second opportunity to remove them, which would be Candlemas, failure to observe this custom is considered inauspicious. So isn't that interesting how it just depends on what part of the world you live in, how you look at that time, right?
Mhm.
My part of
Andy?
the world, in my part of the world, the Christmas decorations come down on Epiphany.
Mhm.
Yeah, but and that's how I always did it. But the old custom would be that yes, they come down on Epiphany, but they don't go up until Christmas Eve.
That would be my preference.
And you know, for the one who typically the job of taking all the decorations off the tree falls to me. So that's a lot of work for only 12 days.
Yeah.
Andy, I have a note in Matthew next to my notation of the visit of the wise men, that in Daniel, the book of Daniel, that Daniel mentions magi or wise men who were astrologers from the East, and that even though they were pagans, they were inspired by Daniel's faith. And that, is that right? I mean, is that what I'm reading?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's remember in Daniel's case, he's gathered by the king gathers all the wise men and sages and seers and everyone he can to try to get him to tell him what his dreams are about. And
Right.
Daniel's the only one who can do it. And so these other people are amazed by what Daniel can do.
But they were but in doing so, Daniel inspired them, and even though they were pagans, they were inspired by Daniel's one true God that empowered him to have those
Right.
visions,
Yes.
and they were so inspired in that way. Those people, many hundreds of years later, would make that trek.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a nice setup for sure. Right.
Mhm.
So then you can think that story resonated in that community.
Right. In the East, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Where the Epiphany was important.
Yes, exactly.
good to take notes. And it's good to write enough of them that you remember what you wrote.
So, where I had this written down. So there's who can tell me about the term in the church, octave? And I'm talking not in a musical sense, but
Come on, Linda. Yeah,
in a
tell
lit-
us, Linda.
I know that.
in a liturgical sense. Does
That
anyone know
eight,
what that term means?
the bris.
That'd be in a week, seven,
Yeah.
8 days.
Well, it would be 8 days, yeah. So what it really corresponds to is that it is that time between when the priest would raise the host at the celebration of a Eucharist on one Sunday to the point where he would do the exact same thing on the following Sunday. That's called an octave, because it's if Sunday counts as day 1, the next Sunday is going to be day 8, right?
Yeah.
I can hear Maggie's excited about that too.
Does it matter which
Can you hear her behind me?
I can.
She's in another room and the door is shut.
I can't make out what she's saying, but I can recognize her voice. I'm sorry, Valerie, go ahead.
I said, does it matter which Eucharist is celebrated at the 8 o'clock or the 15?
Well, yeah. So the point is Sunday to Sunday, right?
Right.
So we talk about the octave of Christmas would be that first celebration of Christmas to the 8th day later. So you have what's called the octave of the Epiphany, which would be January 6th being day 1. So it'd be what? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 being the octave. So today would be the octave of Epiphany. And so there was a sense in the church that because you're in that octave, the color of the feast day of Epiphany is white because it has to do directly with Jesus. And so any service you would do in that octave would then also be white because it's counted to be collected back to that feast day, right? And that would include that first Sunday after the Epiphany, bless you, that would be the baptism of Jesus. So the baptism of Jesus then falls in that octave. So that's sort of the church's explanation of focusing on both the visit of the Magi and the baptism of Jesus, because they both events fall within that octave as the church celebrates it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So where the Eastern Church will focus primarily on the baptism, we focus on the feast day, on the wise men, but the baptism falls within that octave, so it still becomes a primary focus of that. Then you go to ordinary time. Then you go to the green season of Epiphany. But, so this is what I want to tell you earlier. So as I read the collect for Epiphany in our 79 prayer book, there is a rubric that comes after that collect that says, the preceding collect with the psalm and lessons for the Epiphany, or those for the second Sunday after Christmas, serves for weekdays between the Epiphany and the following Sunday. So that, in effect, wipes out the octave and says, just for those days leading up to the following Sunday, you would stay with white and do these things, but then it's going to turn green after that. So so the 79 book sort of wipes out that whole notion of the octave. But the first Sunday after the Feast of the Epiphany, wherever that falls, is always going to be the baptism of Jesus. That's a set thing in the church. So it remains a primary focus of the season.
So when are we going to celebrate the baptism of Jesus?
We just did this past Sunday.
Oh, this past Sunday. Yeah.
Right. But what you notice when you look at, when you're going through the lectionary, what you'll notice is on the second Sunday after Christmas, and Jeff, you had brought this up in lectionary group, there are 3 options for what the gospel could be in year B. which is what we're in. And so that first option is Joseph getting told in the dream to take the child and go to Egypt, which is the one I used. The second option is the wise men coming to see Jesus and offer their gifts. The third option is Jesus teaching in the temple, and they go to Jerusalem to present, not the presentation at 40 days, but doing the thing with the firstborn child when he's 12 years old in the temple. They take Jesus to do that. Remember, they leave and they travel a day and they can't find Jesus. And they turn around and go back and they find him teaching in the temple when he's about 12 years old. So really, you would choose which one of those readings you want to use based on where the second Sunday after Christmas falls in relation to the feast day of the Epiphany. Because you're going to read about the wise men on the feast day anyway. So you may not want to do it on that Sunday. But if the feast day falls in the middle of the week and you aren't going to do a service, then maybe you want to use it so you get it in. So now we have this blending of Epiphany tide stretching into the latter half of Christmas. So there's a gray line there in that latter part of Christmas into Epiphany, because you may actually begin to celebrate the Epiphany a little earlier than the feast day itself, based on how you're going to celebrate that occasion. Does that make sense to anybody?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things you got to think about. When am I going to read what? When am I going to talk about what? How are we going to celebrate it? That makes a difference on what you're going to read, and it shows how in the history of the church, because the Nativity and the Epiphany were celebrated at the same time, and then they pulled Christmas back and left Epiphany where it was, you can see how those lines are blurred, right? I talked in Advent how it used to be that Advent was an 8-week season that stretched from what we call the last few weeks of Pentecost up until Christmas. And so what you get in the end of Pentecost sound like Advent readings, even though we haven't started Advent yet. It's because in the early church, it was Advent. And Advent even went up to January 6th because they hadn't set the date of Christmas yet. But firmly by the 6th century, all those dates were set. And we were able to then try to carry on with some sort of normalcy until we do these things called Vatican II and everyone does liturgical revision. And some of that all goes out the window. So who can tell me another name for Epiphany? Like in the Eastern Church, how do they refer to that day?
The theophany, the
Theophany.
Eastern theophany, right?
Yes, theophany is the correct term in the Greek word. The word itself, epiphany, comes from the Greek meaning manifestation or appearance, and it's derived from the verb. Well, the word is epiphaneia, derives from the verb phanein, meaning to appear. But another term that you would use with the Epiphany, other terms that were used with it, talk about light, the day of light. The Greek is he hemeraton photon, photon being light, the day of lights. And theophany because it is a manifestation of God, right? And we talk about things like the burning bush and Moses. That's a theophany, right? God appearing in the silence to Elijah would be a theophany. And so what Jesus does, the dove coming down on him and the voice from heaven is a theophany. But what's interesting about that to me is, again, that wasn't a publicly recognized thing except in John's gospel. But in synoptics, it's only Jesus that hears that and sees that. But the readers hear it and see it. So it's a manifestation to us. And that's the point I think we forget about sometimes, is that we have to remember it's what we're reading in scripture is for us to understand. And it's not that the people present were necessarily the ones that hear it. It's the reader who needs to hear it, right? They're talking to us. That's why you'll often hear me say in sermons, you know, what Jesus was speaking to the crowds or to the disciples, and what Matthew or Mark wanted us to hear was this.
Well, isn't it true that often our heroes in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, are those that contemplate what they've seen and heard and hold it close to their heart and keep it to themselves? Isn't it interesting that Mary is often glorified because she, at the feast at Cana, she didn't, isn't there in John, doesn't she say something like she contemplated these things, she observed these things and thought about them, and of course.
Well, that's what Luke says at the Nativity, in his rendition of the Nativity. After the shepherds leave, it says, you know, Mary pondered all these things in her heart.
Yeah. I thought there was also some of that at the Cana wedding feast, and there are other times that people keep these things to themselves and think about them.
Right. Yeah, there sure is. But what I remember at the Cana feast is Mary basically telling Jesus to get them some more wine. And she turns to the stewards and says, do whatever he says.
Do whatever he says, you know.
Jesus is like, Mom, I wasn't ready to do that yet.
Well, it was her family, wasn't it? I mean, wasn't somebody at the Cana feast, wasn't it her family? Or
well, we don't know that. We would assume that because that's why they're there.
Yeah, why else would they be there? Yeah.
Right.
And they only invited the disciples they liked.
Well, they're the only ones he had at the time.
Oh, okay. All right.
He hadn't called the others yet.
Those were his only friends, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, with friends like these, who needs enemies? They never listened to him.
What else was I going to share? Oh, here's something interesting on Epiphany. Carols and hymns. Here you go, Linda. You have to forgive my German here. Nun liebe Ziel, nun ist es Zeit is a German Epiphany hymn by Georg Weissel, first printed in 1642. I can't translate that, but two very familiar Christmas carols associated with Epiphany are As with Gladness, Men of Old, written by William Chatterton Dix in 1860 as a response to the many legends which had grown up surrounding the Magi. Do you know that one? That's one from our hymnal.
Yes.
But it's what I guess the tune was associated with a Christmas carol, but I don't think we have that tune with a Christmas carol. We only have it with the Epiphany hymn.
Well, I kind of associate it at Christmas time sometimes, and maybe we know different tunes. I don't know.
Okay. And then we have, of course, We Three Kings of Orient Are, written by the Reverend John Henry Hopkins Jr., then an ordained deacon in the Episcopal Church, instrumental in organizing an elaborate holiday pageant, which featured this hymn for the students of the General Theological Seminary in New York City in 1857 while serving as the seminary's music director. Another popular hymn, I found this interesting, another popular hymn, less known culturally as a carol, is Songs of Thankfulness and Praise.
Oh, yeah, that's very familiar.
With
Yeah.
words written by Christopher Wordsworth and commonly sung to the tune Saint Edmund. To me, that's a classic, Epiphany hymn, but yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a carol.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it says a carol used as an anthem for Epiphany is The Three Kings, but it doesn't say who that's by, so I don't know what that is.
And more, a little bit more up to date, and the children know this one too. I love thinking of, I want to walk as a child of the light, because we're talking about light
Right.
in Epiphany.
Right,
I think that for Epiphany time.
One of the anthems I can remember in choir singing every year during Epiphany in college, and then in other choirs I've been in, was the Mendelssohn, There Shall a Star from Jacob Come Forth.
Yeah.
And a scepter from Israel rise up. Great anthem. A little bit on the long side, but it's worth it.
Say the title of that again. What about Jacob in Israel?
Well, it depends on which whose version of it you do, the way they put the English. But the way I always did it was the older form, which was, there shall a star from Jacob come forth, and a scepter from Israel rise up.
Interesting.
Or others will say it, there shall a star come forth from Jacob, and a scepter from Israel.
I can't remember now.
And what's neat is at the end of the piece, because it's talking about this star that's rising. And at the end of the piece, it ends with the chorale. And we did this just a few weeks ago. What star is thou burning bright? I can't think of it right now. So it ends with this chorale, and then so you end this chorale, and then the music, the organ will play this all the way up into the high octaves, as if you're watching the star go up, rising. And our director would tell us that, and then he'd get mad at us when we would do it, and we'd all finish it, and we'd all go. He's like, no, you can't do that. But you told us about that. All right. Any thoughts or questions on history of Epiphany?
Well, Andy, your mention of the hymn, and I know Valerie and Robin are probably hearing it too. When you mentioned that hymn with Jacob and the scepter from Israel, it reminds me of the reading from John and the mention of the Israelite with no deceit.
Don't give my secrets away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. You're going to hear me talk about it Sunday.
Oh, well, now I'm going to look up Jacob.
But I was reading something today talking about how, the idea was that the Messiah would come back to restore Jacob and restore Israel. So there is always that connection back to Jacob.